trying to understand. Let me share my screen. So this is basically what differentiates network forensics and cloud forensics in that sense. So as we look at virtualization, it's the layer that comes in between, which takes the hardware of a particular system, maybe a server or any system that you look at it. Maybe if you have your desktop machine where you want to run multiple operating systems, you have this hardware. On top of this hardware, you have this virtualization layer which is coming in, and it can permit you to run multiple operating systems. So that's the basic architecture that we will try to look at, right? So this virtualization layer, now what is it able to do? If you try to understand, it is actually taking some of the instructions which are coming from this operating system and executing at this layer, right? So if you look at the building of an operating system which is running on this the physical hardware that we look at, maybe your processor, the network interface card, the RAM, and the hard disk, right? These are the things which are there in a single operating system, right? Now, when you look at this environment and you would like to understand what is the role of virtualization, multiple operating systems are running and multiple operating systems are working with this hardware. So the first thing that will be needed is isolation between these things, right? If you want to run these three operating systems, the three operating systems are feeling that these are logical parts of this, in fact, right? So you cannot have infinite virtual machines can be created, right? But you can, as much as the resource is available here, that much of partitions can be created or divisions can be created, right? So this is how this virtualization layer helps us in trying to do this. Now this becomes a very critical layer in the entire cloud, right? So if you look at a cloud architecture, so this virtualization layer defines, right? So if you look at what used to happen before virtualization, this is how only a single operating system could run on this hardware. Maybe you had the opportunity of running multiple operating systems at the same time, but not concurrently, right? You could either install you could have installed Windows and Ubuntu both at the same time, but you would run only one of them. There would be a grub loader, and you would either go for Windows or you would go for Linux. So that was the environment. Now virtualization made it possible to run multiple operating systems at the same time. So that's one big change which came in. So here we see that this hypervisor is doing this. But what is the hypervisor actually doing it? There are again two types of hypervisors as we look at. The hypervisor is actually trying to facilitate creation of a virtual machine monitor. Sometimes hypervisor is interchangeably used with this hypervisor monitor, VMM they call it. And then you have this these physical hardware are logically presented to the operating system. And that is what is facilitated by this hypervisor. Or the examples are KVM, EXSI by VMware, VMware's cloud-related virtualization software, and then you have Zen Server. Citrix is the organization which does it. So that's how you look at, right? So if you look at the types of hypervisor again, I'm trying to take you back that what is this hypervisor doing here? It is called a bare metal hypervisor. Now, when you look at a bare metal hypervisor, it is directly running on the hardware. And most of us know that the operating system is the one which is an interface between the hardware and the users. So on the top of the users are using various apps or interacting with the operating system, and the operating system is interacting with the hardware. So this is the kind of mechanism which we understand. But here is a mechanism where I'm running multiple operating systems, but not having an interface, not having an operating system. So here is a case where the hypervisor itself acts as an operating system. So now in a cloud environment, typical cloud environment, if you look at the typical cloud environment, you will have, you don't have this guest operating system. That is where we do on our laptop or on desktop. When we do it, we have a guest operating system, maybe a Windows or an Ubuntu. On top of that, we have VirtualBox, or now you can try KVM and Zen. And on top of that, you can have other operating systems like FreeBSD, Ubuntu, Fedora, Red Hat Enterprise Linux or any of these softwares that you can install on top of that and create virtual machines, right? Now, how is the communication going on? What does the virtualization layer do is another question. So if you are aware of rings in operating systems, operating system talks with has privilege levels, right? Maybe if you have not studied in your operating system code, now somebody who has prepared Gate, if they are here, they would definitely know what are rings, right? Operating system rings are privilege levels, right? So there's no physical rings as such, but the logical rings in the mindset, right? That there are levels of permission that are given. So the operating system actually sits at the ring, what do you call the lowest ring, ring 0, right? Hardware on top of that is a ring 0, then ring 1, ring 2, ring 3. On ring 3 is the apps which are running, applications are running at ring 3. So there are some privilege layers. So the operating system is sitting at ring 0 and handling this whole part. Now, if somebody wants to communicate, right, and you are taking that layer below the operating system. When you're taking that below the layer of the operating system, now you are creating a ring -1. It's a logical ring anyway, so you can keep numbering below 0. So hence you call it ring -1. That is where you pitch in your hypervisor. So now operating system has a certain level of privilege and it has to talk to the hardware. But in between is this hypervisor layer, because it is catering to maybe 3 operating systems or 10 operating systems, depending on the scale at which you are operating, the size of the cloud that you look at. If there are 10 VMs or 100 VMs, the hypervisor is handling those number of VMs on that server. So now I have to take the instructions from there and try to talk to the hardware. That's my role. That's the virtualization role. Now, there are a lot of information which can be available with the hypervisor. Now, if you ask me what the hypervisor will have, it will have all these 3 operating systems information. All the functions that are being sent, everything can be easily identified, right? What is the network address? How much is the RAM? How much is the storage? What is there? What is available? Everything is available with the hypervisor. In case of physical machines, we are not able to manage that. Here, if you're having an address, an address cannot be traced because the source address you can try to make up. But here, the source address can be checked by somebody. Who can check it? The hypervisor can check it. So this is slightly a different way of approaching. But then till now, there's not much work done on in case of attribution. So we'll try to understand attribution. But before that, I just wanted to bring in this concept of this hypervisor so that you will understand what actually we are trying to bring in, right? From here, we will move into what is try to understand attribution. We will come back to this point again at a later point of time, right? So just let's try to understand how it goes, right? Now let me come back to understanding what is the kind of attribution. Now, what is attribution? If you hear because my theme is cloud attribution. To start with cloud attribution, I just started with understanding of the term hypervisor. What is hypervisor is doing? Hypervisor is collecting some information from the different operating systems and translating. Binary translation is what is being done. So it is translating the words of the operating system so that it is understood by the hardware. So that is what is the role of this thing. And in fact, many of you may be surprised where you heard the first time where you heard the word virtual machine. Maybe in cloud or in the recent talks, you would have heard about virtual machine first time. When you created a virtual machine first time, you would have created. But sometimes if you rack up your memory, you go back a little more, right? Then you remember that Java virtual machine first time you heard when you worked with Java. And there you got Java virtual machine. Now, what is Java virtual machine? So I was asking recently some of the students also, they were also surprised. What was Java virtual machine? Nobody is able to recollect. But Java virtual machine was the system which facilitated the powerful concept of platform independence. Now, what is platform independence? So you can create a Java application on an Intel machine, right? And you can take the code and run it on a machine which is having a PowerPC maybe, right? Or AMD. You have compiled on Intel, but you can make it work on that. Similarly, on Intel, you may have Windows, and on this AMD system, you are having Fedora or Linux, some flavor of Linux. Now you're taking a Windows file. Can you run it on a Ubuntu file or a Fedora file, a Fedora OS? It appears very difficult because the kind of Java syntax that we do and all that is difficult, because the class file, the executable file we are taking. Maybe if you do Turbo C, you take it, and GCC, you take it, right? GCC is Linux environment. Let us say that GCC file, and you try to take it and run it on a Turbo C. Sometimes it becomes difficult. I'm not talking about the source file. Source file anyway. Take the C source file, hello world, copy it there and run it on a notepad. It works fine. But I'm talking about in Windows, if you develop a .exe file and take it and want to run it using a.out on a Linux environment, it won't work. But in the case of class file of Java, you compile a class file in Windows, take the class file and run it on Linux, it works fine. Only condition is Java virtual machine must be there in both these systems, right? Or the Java software must be installed in both these systems. In fact, sometimes you can run it on the browser, because the browser at that earlier point of time, Netscape browser came up with this Java virtual machine. Later, Internet Explorer inserted this into its browser itself, into the operating system itself. And then there was a big fight between Microsoft and Netscape, right? Of course, anyway, people said, okay, you can, it's open source and you can keep it and you can add it. Finally, the case was closed. But otherwise, if it was specific to Netscape, Netscape Navigator was the browser at one point of time. Now it's not there because Sun Microsystems and Sun was taken over by Oracle. So a lot of these things, we can leave it anyway. So the point that I'm coming back is that wonderful concept of virtual machine facilitated, Java virtual machine facilitated that here the code could be executed. So maybe here the programming environment is maybe English language. Let us say, just take for example, that whole understanding is English language. So the bytecode was generated in English language. Now you are going to the other machine, and to understand platform independence, let us say you are executing in Hindi. So there's a language change, but the bytecode, it has to understand English, and here the bytecode has to understand Hindi. So both these things are possible, and that was facilitated by what is this mechanism called Java virtual machine. So bringing that back into computational world, VMware introduced. In fact, we hear about cloud only in 2010 and all, but the concept of virtualization is much earlier. In fact, virtualization, people were thinking about virtual machines for a long time. And if you go back, track that virtual machine concept, goes very, maybe 1998 or something. Maybe you find the first paper 23 years ago, right? But then the beauty of it is that virtualization was done where some operating system instructions, which are at the privilege layer, which are not now available to run at ring 0, because there is something ring -1 also. So ring -1 captures some of the instructions which is not able to understand. It modifies it, it translates it, called binary translation, and makes the operating system understand it, right? So that is something that you can try to understand. And maybe if you're not understanding that part, let me quickly show you that diagram so that you will quickly be able to understand. So I think this is very critical for our understanding of today's lecture, right? Because we are going to understand how we try to manage attribution is what is the thing. So let me share that aspect of rings here. So this is what we call about the rings, right? So we have these rings where the operating system is running at ring 0 and the user apps are running at these things. So ring 0 is the most privileged. So when we go down, we see that when you want to do virtualizing, if you want to do that virtualization, right, you have to place the virtualization layer below the operating system somewhere here. So then it is difficult to capture and translate the privileged OS instructions. If you take ring 0, the OS has to move to ring 1. So whatever is ring 1 is lower privilege than ring 0. So ring 0, whatever is running on ring 0 cannot actually take ring 1, and ring 1 cannot directly communicate with hardware. It has to come to ring 0, but ring 0's privilege levels are different. So how do you do that? Is there are some instructions which directly, this is how usually it is done. But now when you want to do translation, now what you do, you try to bring in what is called hypervisor here, and this is called full virtualization. When full virtualization is there, the guest OS is running one level higher, and this is the hardware. You can consider this is a bare metal hypervisor. It is running on the hardware and it is running on the guest OS. So now what happens? It provides virtual components to each VM and performs the binary translation of non-virtualizable OS instructions. So there are some non-virtualizable OS instructions which are sitting in ring 1, and if you are sending it to ring 0, they cannot be understood by the computer hardware because this is at ring 0, but the highest privilege level here, but this is one level low. So whatever has to come from here, it doesn't. So what it does is the hypervisor translates, it binary translates. So that's why it's called full virtualization. The second level, what you do is you place the hypervisor at ring -1, logically ring -1. So what happens here? On ring 0, there must be an operating system which understands that there is a hypervisor below me. So it is called para-virtualized OS, or it is called OS-assisted virtualization. Here it is full virtualization because only the hypervisor does all the virtualization aspect. Here it is called para-virtualization, partly virtualization it is, because this OS is virtualized. It is a modified OS, right? So it only works with Linux or OpenBSD. It doesn't work with Windows, right? So a para-virtualized OS is only a Windows environment. It's only a Linux environment or a BSD environment. So here we have, and the hypervisor will be running at ring -1. And then you can directly send the instructions here. So here what happens is this para-virtualized instructions, the OS knows, so it sends what are called hypercalls. It sends what are called hypercalls. Usually OS sitting in ring 0, when it was directly talking to the hardware, we know that it talks with system calls, right? So these system calls are there, but now we have hypercalls. Now these hypercalls understand that there is another layer below. So whatever they want to do, they talk with the virtualization layer. System calls, OS talks to the hardware. Hypercalls, the operating system talks with the hypervisor, and the hypervisor converts them and sends them to the hardware. So this is what is called para-virtualization. The next level virtualization, as you see, the VMM is running in ring -1. You have the hardware assisted virtualization. Here it was para virtualization, OS is virtualized. So it is called OS assisted virtualization. Now we have hardware assisted virtualization, which are again specifically to Intel processors, AMD processors, which are virtualized. Now if you go for i3, i5, i7 processors, i3 and i5 do not have this virtualization support. VTX is not there. Only i7 has VT support. So that is where if you want to do cloud computing with i3 processors and i5 processors, you can't do it. So that's why you need workstations, that's why you need higher servers. So you have this hardware assisted virtualization. Why am I taking you here? Why am I introducing this at this point? Because if you want to understand the complete aspect of trying to understand how it goes, you need to understand how actually what is happening. Hello? Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are audible.
My screen is not moving. Okay, let me connect again. Yeah, sorry, there was some network disturbance in my office, right? Yeah, sorry for that. So here we are actually trying to compare these aspects of virtualization. Now let me come back to source attribution. Now attribution is a term which is a legal term. In fact, when you talk about cloud forensics, forensics is a legal work, right? What is forensics? If we have discussed in the last class when I took that differentiation between security and forensics, right? What is security? Security wants to stop attacks from happening, right? And forensics wants the attacks to happen so that it will investigate. The term that is used is post-attack investigation. So attack should complete. And many people try to do real-time forensics. Real-time forensics is while the attack is happening, I will investigate and stop it. Very difficult, right? Security itself is difficult now. Most of the time, security fails, and forensics helps. Why does forensics help? Because forensics keeps some parameters for observation. So people are observing, people are monitoring a lot of things. Now, what is the role of a network security guy or a network administrator? He continuously monitors the behavior of what is coming in, what is going out. So that is what is there. Now, I told you that day on forensics, if there is a surveillance camera, right? How people behave inside a mall, right? And how people behave if there is no camera, right? In a shop, in a mobile phone shop, yeah, yeah. If crime happen, then only we can do forensics. But then, what is the use of forensics after the crime has happened? Many people will say. Now, many people will say murder has happened. Now, you should stop before the person is killed. What is the use of investigating how the person died after the person is no more? I understand the sympathy of the person. Maybe if one of our relative passed away, we are so angry, right? But because somebody died and people investigated how that person died, so they are able to track the way modus operandi they say how the technique they have used, what is the methodology they have used. If you are able to find out, next you will be able to stop some more attacks. You will be more cautious about that thing. Now, how are serial killers nabbed? Right? There are some people are going on killing every month or every 10 days, somebody is killing somebody, right? And we are not able to find out. But if you study a pattern, slowly you will understand that yes, we can try to bring in. That is what is actually what is called forensics. Going back, and now the attack is successful. Predictive analytics of attack can help. Yeah, but then how much can you predict? Can you predict the behavior of every attacker? Can you predict what kind of attack he will do? Can you predict the vulnerabilities of all the software? Right now, when somebody, I think Dr. Chirag Modi would have discussed with you, I discussed some attacks with you, but the point that comes back is how many attack scenarios will be same. When I described some attacks, and we have discussed in one of the paper, my student has discussed lot of attacks on cloud computing, right? It has already reached some 150 citations and all, right? So a lot of reading was done, and lot of attacks were described in that paper. Now, I asked some BTech students last year and that before year to implement those attacks. And when we were trying to actually practically see how an attack can happen, maybe only at the hypervisor layer, not even at the cloud layer, we were trying to do that. But the students struggled because they said, "Sir, this attack was possible on that version of the hypervisor, on that version of the cloud system. But on this version now, what is latest, these things are plugged. Now they are not possible. Now even the same thing, maybe you have Windows 6, 7, 8, those attacks that were there are different. The Windows 10 is more robust. Now, whatever Windows 10 attacks now are happening, maybe the Windows 11 which is coming up, you may not be able to have that because things are hardened, things are made robust. Now you cannot go back to that. So that's another question. So hence, how much you can predict? If we can predict all the attacks, then there is absolutely no problem. We can actually, what do you say? There will be no problem in that sense of the attack happening at all, right? We can stop all of them. So we cannot predict most of the attacks also. That's another problem. And there are a variety of software, there are a variety of cloud environments, there are a variety of attackers. Each fellow comes with a new idea, different idea. But yes, definitely, that's the issue that we tend to understand. Now, if I want to find out where the attack came from, that's what I am trying to understand here. Where did the attack come from? So that is something is a question. How do I find out? How do I understand where these attacks are? No, I am not sharing. I am not sharing. I am talking, right? So I do many times we have used to this kind of lectures where some slide is running and all. So wherever required, I will show something, and wherever not required, I will come back to this mode, right? So here we are trying to understand now how do we try to understand how a attack happens is what is the thing. So before this what do you say cloud forensics was being discussed, we discussed what was network forensics. In fact, the term digital forensics, I think the first day scientist Gaurav Gupta sir, no, I'm not sharing my screen. Am I sharing my screen? No. So can we forensics new versions? Yeah. See, the point that happens is you need to find out and understand what are the vulnerabilities that are happening in many of the new hypervisors. Now, my challenge is maybe 2 days ago I talked about KVM and Zen, and I encouraged you to set up KVM, right? I don't know how many of you would have set up KVM hypervisor or anything, right? So if you set up now and then you read what are the vulnerabilities, or maybe you use Red Hat Enterprise Linux as a base operating system. On top of that, you do that, or a bare metal hypervisor if you set up. Then if you read the vulnerabilities, and if the vulnerabilities can be compromised, then attacks are possible. If you are able to simulate that attack, then you can investigate that attack, right? So as of now, it becomes very difficult for that. So if you look at, there are 3 processes that I talked about on the day 1, right? We talked about the first aspect being that first attack is acquisition of data, collection of data. Second is we try to we try to do analysis of the data collected. Whatever data was collected, we try to analyze the data. And the last one was when we look at it, we try to understand that we have to do the attribution, right? So this was what was discussed, or this was what was thought about on that day when I talked about these things. So I was just trying to locate those slides so that we can have a look at that, right? So the basic idea is when we look at those 3 aspects, right? So majority of the work that is going on is on analysis. When you look at forensics, it goes back to the major chunk of it works on the analysis that happens. How do we analyze it? Again, going back to most of the part of that analysis is actually coming back to machine learning these days, or deep learning these days. So collection of these attacks, implementation of these attacks, and collection of these data sets, right? So that is what actually happens. So when let me tell you, okay, this is the diagram, right? So so when we look at if I want to understand how it happens, so these are the 3 terms that we are wanting to look at, right? So there are so many aspects that are there here. When we look at these are various phases, but this analysis becomes the major important aspect in all of them. Examination and analysis becomes the most important aspect, because it is very easy to collect the data, and I think Anand was explaining various tools to how to collect the data, what are the points to collect the data, and then analyze it, and then finally attribute it, present it, right? So that is what we are doing. We are collecting the data. We are acquisition and collecting is the same, and then we are preserving the data, and finally what we are doing is attribution of the attack. So major portion, if you look at it, this is 10% and this is 20%, but this is 70%. Analysis is 70%, right? So we need to do that, and how do we do that is the question, right? So when we try to understand now how to do this analysis, how it came from. So it all started with the digital forensics. Initially it was computer forensics, where on a computer drive, okay, what was the data? Where was the data? Data was only available on an operating system, right? So operating system logs or operating system files that have been modified, the file features, the file characteristics that have been identified. In the case of Linux environments, maybe the file inode structures and the modifications that were done to the inodes. Okay, so some of these data was collected and analyzed. What file was saved, because you have the file attributes, when it was last modified, when it was last accessed, who accessed it, who modified it, who had the permissions, who created link files. So these were computer forensics. So in fact, when this Satyam founder, Mr. Ramalinga Raju, was arrested, immediately all his laptops and computers were seized. The first thing they did. Why? Because whatever data is available, they could retrieve. Maybe by that time they would have formatted already, because anyway he wanted to surrender. So maybe he formatted all the hard disk, all the information was gone, something like that. But we see that people digged out some data and analyzed. That was computer forensics. Later people moved on, because it came onto the networks. Because of internet, all the computers were not simple desktops, right? So a lot of data was networked, and the data was moving across, and then that is this thing, right? So a lot of these investigations moved on to the network layer. It was called network forensics. Now, where do you capture the data in network forensics was another challenge, right? So that's where my interest of attribution started. So let me share a little bit of my own research. Maybe this is 10 years old, but let me share so that you get some idea on what we are talking about, right? So this is something here, right? So when we look at what is attribution in that point, attribution is trying to do a trace back, right? What is trace back? So this is something from my PhD slides, right? So we had trace back. Trace back. What could you trace back? How you could trace back is a question. If you ask me how you could trace back, the only way on a network to trace back to the source is only the medium of communication is packets. So packets are coming from some other source, somebody is sending, and we are able to find out. Now, most of you may say, sir, very easy. There is a source address in every packet. Why don't you go and find out that source address? But what is the problem of source address? Source address is never verified. Source address is never verified. So what I can do as an attacker, if I am, the intelligent thing that I will do is I will definitely not put my source address. I will put somebody else's address and send my packets. I release 10,000 packets as attack packets. I release 10,000 packets attacking one source. So what I do, I send all those 10,000 packets. All the 10,000 packets are going with different IP addresses. In fact, I can write a small script. Go to GitHub or go to Google and say I want to do IP spoofing. You will easily get so many codes. Very easy to do that, and then you can send the so many packets. So any attacker will not put his source IP in his address. So hence the biggest challenge is source IP. The second challenge is network address translation. What is network address translation? Now you are sitting in NIT Sikkim, I am sitting in NIT Jaipur, some of you are sitting in different institutions. Each of the institution has a router in which your network internet is connected to. You are connected to BSNL or different organizations which are providing Reliance and all. They are providing their internet services, fiber internet over the fiber, and then you are taking the connection. So it has some IP address. Inside the campus, you have different private IPs, they call it. So it's called network address translation. I don't have much time to tell you all these. So you please refer what is network address translation. So what happens that there is some 202 dot something IDs there for NIT Jaipur, let us say, Now inside we have 172.168 some IPs there. Maybe in your institution you may have 192.168 dot something. So some address is there, right? So like that, there are some 5,000 addresses which are represented by one single IP to the outside world called 202 dot something. So that's what is called a public IP. So now it's not easy because inside 5,000 people are sending, to the outside world it is a single IP, network address translation. So this was a major aspect. So how do you identify the actual source of any packet access sent across the internet? So that is the aim of the traceback. Is basically to find out where the source of the attack is coming from. I may not be able to know the actual individual, but if I at least know the network, but at least if I know the geographical location, if at least I know from which organization it is coming, that's a great thing. That is best thing that we can do. And you can implicate the attackers, right? You can find out and then you can say, okay, somebody in your organization did it or something like that, and prosecute them for malicious action. But that it is very difficult for us to see that it's not easy to do this work that we are trying to work out. So very difficult and hence very not very easy, and hence we can't do that, right? So that is something which you can try to look at. And here is some of these terms that we tend to understand. So this is a mechanism, let us say. This is the victim, and there are different routers. You are different hosts, and maybe one of the attacker. There are different people are sending traffic. The traffic is coming. But here is this attacker is sending the traffic. It is coming through different routes. From sender to one user. It comes through different route, maybe 7 steps or 8 steps it takes before it reaches the destination. So different routers facilitate the movement, right? So now traceback will be going backwards, right, from the victim. If R1, so this let us say this is the attack. Now going back in this direction and finding who has sent it is what is attribution. Or I am trying to find the source of the attacker. I am attributing the attack to the attacker here. I am the victim here, and I am trying to find out. So I am trying to find out where the packets are coming from. So that's what we can try to understand, right? So, but then you can't stop the attack. You can only identify the source of the attack. Of course, later then you can do something like proactive measures, and these things, they are called proactive measures. You can log the packets. You can mark the packets. Just imagine marking of packets. So there must be software which is running on every router. It must mark the packet with the source address or some symbol or some mark saying that the packet is coming from this direction. In fact, if you look at many of the manufacturers, let us say in the US, Cisco is manufacturing, or Extreme or Juniper or HP, they are manufacturing their this thing. So if the government asks them, now Cisco should be in a position to tell where these packets have come from. So they would have decided, they would have designed, because most of the companies know that packets are going through our switches, our routers, and they are all from the organization, right? So when the packet is going, there may be some fields in the packet where I can try to mark some data and send it in the packet, because the source address is not verified. Otherwise, we build a mechanism where source address is verified. Source address is not verified. And hence you have that. Then there are some autonomous system-based mechanisms, the packet marking mechanisms. Some are probabilistic marking, some are deterministic marking. So this is how this was the things. So attackers are able to generate and send any packet. Attackers are aware of the traceback ability. And now once you try to do some mechanism of traceback, the attacker will be more intelligent. He will try to ensure that he will send so many packets. And he will distribute the attack in such a way that even if the packets are marked probabilistically or deterministically, you still can't catch them, right? The routers possess limiting processing and storage capabilities, because traceback will want that the routers will try to do that and all. So that's not possible. So let me quickly take you through this point, right? So let us look at some diagram. So if you look at this diagram, these are autonomous systems. Autonomous systems are big networks, right? Huge networks. Then there are what are called edge routers. There are edge routers. These are all called edge routers, every autonomous system. And there are some internal routers, internal routes. So whenever you are traveling from here, one hop, 2 hop, 3 hop, 4 hop, 5 hop, and you reach the victim. So this is how these routers are all connected, right? And these edge routers is where you can this edge router is actually giving you a geographical, I put it in nice circles, but they are not, maybe not in nice circles. So maybe if you look at a closer diagram like this, so it is leaving this edge router, and these two edge routers are connected. These whole autonomous systems are connected by these two edge routers. This is network forensics we are talking about, right? In a similar sense, maybe if you look at these idea, so let me skip some part here. So where do you store this data? You can store the data in some of the TCP/IP version 4 header fields, right? So here these are some fields which are there. So you can exactly use this identification field and use this number, because fragmentation is very less now these days. So hence this fragmentation field, the entire field is not used. So you can put a number here, you can put another number here and send it in the packets, and then you know where it is coming from. At least you are coming to the autonomous system address or the first router from which the packet entered. That can be easily find out, right? So these two things can come up. So that is one level of this thing, some algorithms. Let me quickly skip this. And there's another level, we simulated them on NS2 at that point of time, like this, and you could create autonomous systems and do that. The other aspect is interface marking. After the router, from the router, let us say there are some interfaces between the switches and the routers. There are some interfaces. So you not only mark, maybe if you are able to get to the switch, that is great, but you may not be able to get to the switch. You may be able to get to the last point, that is the router. But from the router, if you know from which interface it is coming, right? A router is connected with some 4,000 interfaces. So then at least these 4,000, we don't know who is sending from one of those 4,000. But if you are not able to know the interface, we will be able to identify. A closer diagram will be something like this. An attacker can send directly to the router, or he may come to this router, or it may come to this switch, and from the switch it may come to this router. So different interfaces it is coming from. So at least you will know if I'm able to mark the interface also. So the basic idea is you mark that interface in this, the router IP address and the router interface number, you mark it, right? So this was network forensics, right? So let me stop sharing here. That was easy because it was packets at that point of time. Packets had to be analyzed, and packets was the only way to get back to the source. If I am able to ensure that packets where they are coming from are marked, I can easily calculate towards at the end location. I can know where it is coming from, and then I can do some attribution. That's all. Because spoofed IPs you cannot work out, you cannot find out. It's very difficult. Now the question that comes is, in cloud, how do we do it? In cloud, it becomes even more difficult, because what is happening, the packets are coming in not only onto the network, but the packets are moving in to the aspect of the virtualization layer also. Now let us say in a virtualization aspect, now each of the virtual machine will have another address. So what happens? Let us say there is a college, and in the college there is a cloud. So what happens in the cloud? There are so many virtual machines running. So already the servers are having some IPs which are different from the public IP, the servers IPs. On the servers, there are virtual machines which are running, which have different IPs again. So many levels of translation has to happen, and you have to go back and analyze those translations. So that's the biggest choice. And then again, of course, there is a small help as well. What is the help? The help is we have some, what do you call, this virtualization software has some kind of information among itself. So it keeps track of that information, and you are able to actually get hold of that traffic, and then you can do something, right? So let me show you one of these architectures that we started working with. This is called the OpenStack architecture, right? So let me share that. So this is an OpenStack architecture. So this OpenStack architecture, here you have, let us say I have a 4-node architecture here. Like there are 4 nodes. So if there are 4 nodes, 2 of the nodes are fixed. One is a controller server and one is a networking server. It is already fixed. So 2 other nodes become compute node and the compute node 2, compute node 1 and compute node 2. If there are 8 nodes, 2 nodes will go to this controller and network nodes. There will be 6 more nodes. If there are 100 nodes, 2 nodes controller node and networking node, 98 compute nodes. That's the architecture of cloud, right? Now, if you look at it in a slightly bigger diagram screen, now here you have one network which is coming from outside. Here are the users. The users are connecting to the network. They are coming from outside, right? So this is what is called external network. And inside there are two networks. One is called the tenant network and one is called the management network. Now here, when you look at these things, the controller will have a connection to the management network. The networking server is also connected to the management network. All the compute nodes are connected to the management network. So this is one architecture. The second network is tenant network. In the tenant network, the compute servers are connected and the networking server is also connected. The difference between the management network and the tenant network is only the thing is that the controller server is not there on the tenant network. It's there only on the management network. And the third network is outside. So on a networking server, there are three internet connections, or called Ethernet connections. There are three Ethernet ports. The three Ethernet ports are connected, and in fact, you have three different addresses, three different networks running here. This is outside network. This is inside. There are two networks, right? So now it becomes even more complicated attribution, if I like to look at it, right? So now when an attacker has to attack from here outside the CSP, he has to come here, compromise this, get into one of these networks. Getting into management network will be very difficult. You can get into a tenant network, because I told you in India there is what is called one company which I mentioned, right? What was that? There's one company which manufactures cloud resources, right? So that is called I'm not able to recollect, right? There's only one cloud manufacturer, right? One is Control-S, one NetMagic, right? NetMagic is the company. On NetMagic, Flipkart is running, right? And Hindu newspaper is running. Myntra is running on NetMagic. NetMagic is the cloud service provider, and on that, Flipkart has set up his office. Flipkart has set up his application. So what happened? Let us suppose this is NetMagic's office. NetMagic has given some virtual machines to Flipkart. Now, virtual machines are running Flipkart application. Maybe 100 virtual machines are running Flipkart application, because so many clients want to access Flipkart's resources. So Flipkart's, they want to do the shopping on Flipkart. So they come like that. So where are they coming from? If these Flipkart software is running on these virtual machines, users are connecting to these virtual machines. Where are the users coming from? Users are coming from the outside world. How are they getting connected? They are coming here, because whenever you type flipkart.com, you are actually getting the address of this address location. So you type flipkart.com, it comes here, it immediately translates onto the tenant network, it goes to the hardware, it comes to the VMware, virtual machine monitor, or the hypervisor, then it comes to these virtual machines. And these virtual machines can be investigated. So this is the whole thing. These virtual machines can be attacked. So as a user, I can come in onto this network, come into this hardware, come into this virtual machine and come here. This is what I can do. Now, the point is, how do I get back to that person? He has come in here and done some nonsense here. Now, how do I get back is the attacker's information. That becomes even more challenging. So my thought, as I pitch in here, my thought is that how do we do it? It's very difficult. Now, who is observing these virtual machines? Nobody is observing the virtual machines. In fact, Anand was just sharing some tools on AWS. You can monitor AWS virtual machines. Similarly, Google Cloud also gives you an API. Right? Beautiful. What they've done is they did not create tools to monitor. They said, we'll give you API by which you can interact with your virtual machine. You create a virtual machine. You want to monitor your virtual machine. You don't believe on our monitoring. Okay, you do it. We'll give you some APIs. You write some scripts and then interact with your own virtual machine. Safeguard your own virtual machine and then be happy about it. So many people take those scripts and keep monitoring. They set up some rough tools. They are monitoring data on that and see if something hanky-panky is going on, then they will try to take action on that. But otherwise, there is nothing that is there. So some of these tools, ready-made tools are not there, and there is no attribution. It's very limited work. It's a big area. From a long time, I'm looking for somebody who will be able to take up cloud forensic attribution as a research problem. Very difficult. It's not impossible, but it is difficult. So what I want to highlight today is, where can we start? Where can we start? We started with a tool called virtual machine introspection. What does this virtual machine introspection do? It sits on a hypervisor and observes it. So sitting on yourself, you can observe. So that is not really great. It is like you are sitting on a branch on the tree, and somebody is attacking you. So you don't chop off the branch. You fall down. So if you are sitting on a virtual machine, and if the virtual machine is getting compromised, and you will be at a loss. So what we looked at in a Zen architecture, Zen server architecture, the Zen is a software which is used. So on a Zen hypervisor, you have what is called a DOM 0. Now, before a virtual machine is created, a default virtual machine is created in Zen. So if there are 10 virtual machines running, there are actually 11 virtual machines running, because one virtual machine is keeping track of all these 10 virtual machines, and that is called the DOM U. Then there are some this is DOM 0, and they are DOM U1, DOM U2, and all. That's the kind of architecture that is there. So now this virtual machine can introspect, can observe what is happening in these virtual machines. So it can observe system calls. I talked about hyper calls. It can observe hyper calls. It can observe what are the files that are being modified. It can observe what are the changes that are happening in the VM operating system. It can also consider logs at the hypervisor layer, that is at the VMM layer, or at the client level, that is at the operating system layer, and then we can try to come to some conclusion. So first level, if you want to do attribution, if I want to find out the source, I need to observe the virtual machines. That's the first one. Then the second aspect is I can observe the hypervisor also. As of now, hypervisor introspection is not a tool that is developed, but a lot of work has been done on hypervisor introspection, right? You are able to look at security aspects of hypervisor introspection. So you can take the tool hypervisor introspection, and you can monitor the hypervisor. Hypervisor will have more data. Any packets going out of the cloud, very easy to find out, because any virtual machine, if it has to send a packet onto this network called tenant network, or onto this managerial network, it has to go through the VMM, it has to go through the hardware, and it has to go through these networks. So what actually happens? It goes through this hypervisor. All packets have to go through the hypervisor, and at the hypervisor, you can check the source address. So attacks going out of the cloud, you can easily find out, because hypervisor only gives the addresses. So hypervisor knows if it is coming on this interface, hypervisor knows. If it is coming from this virtual machine, hypervisor knows. Both the things are very much clear for the hypervisor. The hypervisor can very clearly update and say that this is a wrong address, the wrong packet is going, this packet is malicious, outgoing packets. But what about incoming packets? Very difficult. Incoming packets, which are source spoofed IPs. So how do you generate, or how do you go back and find out what is the address? In the case of network security, packet marking was done. That's okay. But in the case of hypervisor, how do you do that? Outgoing is very easy, because everything can be monitored at the hypervisor layer. Anything that is going on out or coming in can be monitored, and you can take action on that. So that is something. Now, how do we actually present it to this court of law? It's called presentation. Now you will have to collect the data at various levels. So you have to collect attacks information at state level. You have to collect information at what do you call the next level, and also at the main level, that is the software that is maintaining it, right? So in effect, at the virtual machine layer, at the hypervisor layer, at the network server layer, here also you will get a lot of information. On the controller server, you will get information. On the VMs that are actually interacting, you will get information. Now, how do you correlate that, evaluate that, and try to bring that out? That is the biggest challenge. As of now, hardly some storage level investigation was done and attributed. because attribution is positive and negative. What is a positive attribution? I have drawn this diagram. I have written this paper. This paper is attributed to me. I am the author of this paper or author of this book. That is attribution. That's called positive attribution. The negative attribution is who done it, right? We always ask who done it. You know? In a house, if a small glass breaks, right? A glass tumbler breaks, then first mommy will ask who done it. Parents will ask who did it. Why? How is this glass broken? You tell. That is attribution. That is negative attribution, in fact, or the attribution used in the negative sense. We are trying to capture, or we are able to hold somebody responsible. We are hold somebody accountable. So that's the challenge that is there. Now, how do you attribute the cloud traffic? So whatever is causing the hypervisor, if you are able to identify, that will be a great thing. Because here you see there are variety of attacks. The numbers, line numbers, talk about different attacks. So they talk about different options here. As you see, the numbers are mentioned here. The attacks can happen between VMs. Attacks can happen between VMs on different physical servers. Attacks can happen anywhere, right? So these are the aspects that are thinking. Hypervisors can be compromised. Virtual machines can be compromised. So all these things are going to happen, and hence we need to take precautions. So if in forensics now, the challenge is if I want to do source attribution, where the attribution is come, where the attack has come from. I want to say he has done the attack, or this organization has done this attack, or this country has done this attack. Now, how can we prove that? How can we stop them, or how can we prove that what is happening is wrong? So that's the biggest challenge. So we need tools like virtual machine introspection, tools like hypervisor introspection, which will collect the data from at the hypervisor layer and the virtual machine layer, and then we'll be able to construct. So most of the time, whenever some big gruesome accident happens, or some case happens, criminal case happens, they reconstruct the case. The same thing can be done. Reconstruction can be done. Now, what does forensics do? Forensics actually does a post-attack investigation, post-attack scenario. What is a post-attack scenario? Attack has happened. Now you collect the data and then you analyze what actually happened. Now that's also wonderful research, because if you know what happens in the future for every period of time, you are ready for that. You will try to look at what can happen. So that is something that we need to understand. The first challenge is the words that are used are called readiness. In a cloud environment, if you can if somebody is connecting to cloud, let us say AWS or Google Cloud or something, so I try to understand what is the architecture and the mode of communication, and then try to place a sensor or a readiness model, right? So we are ready to capture any information at the client level. Somebody is connecting to the cloud remotely. Usually cloud gets connected remotely. So that's what is called cloud endpoint forensics. In fact, Anand would have shared some part of that. Dr. Anand would have shared endpoint forensics, maybe OneDrive, SkyDrive, Google Drive, variety of aspects had these. You can investigate if somebody steals, if somebody makes modifications, if somebody corrupts the data, then you can actually try to capture him and find out, right? So that is something that that can be possible. So that is one thing. At the hypervisor layer, at the virtual machine layer is what we need to really find out. And after that, it is very difficult to. So now if I want to attribute something on the cloud, so we have to do at the virtual machine level, that is called VMI, at the hypervisor layer called the HVI. So you can do that. And actually, most of the time, what actually happens here is, if I want to identify how this virtual machine can be compromised, you work very closely with hardware. So mostly these are hardware attacks that actually help in compromising virtual machine monitors, compromising virtual machines and all. So I talked about what you call that aspect at the beginning, right? What is that? The aspect at the beginning which mentioned rings, that hardware. So the hardware has to be compromised. The hardware has to make it work like that, and from there it actually goes to that location, right? So that is something that we need to understand. So a big challenge as we look at this aspect of source attribution in cloud forensics. Not much work has been done. You search Google, you search GitHub, everywhere you search, there is absolutely no work on cloud forensics. Only here and there a little bit of memory forensics and these things are there, but the actual cloud forensics is where some packets or some data is coming from one source and it is reaching another source, and there is a lot of interoperability issues also there, but all those things are taken care and handled. But how do I, as a virtual machine gets compromised, how do I go back and find out this thing? So till here I cannot go, because that's network security. Let the network security guys help us. So coming inside the hypervisor, maybe from within whatever is going out, if I can try to find out, and from whatever is coming in, if it's coming from somewhere here, and probably if it is coming with a what you call a relational result, then you can try to actually capture the person. So it is very difficult to find out who done it or who did it. Very difficult in a cloud environment. The moment somebody is detected or somebody is finding out, right, investigating, the person can immediately disconnect from the internet and nobody can trace it. That's the biggest disadvantage in the case of network forensics and in the case of cloud forensics. But attacks are happening. Investigation also has to happen. There are challenges, there are openings, but how do we start and where do we start? It's a big issue. So the point is, we have to master not only setting up hypervisors, we have to setting up tools like VMI, virtual machine introspection, which can be set up in DOM 0, and you can observe the other VMs also. And based on these, based on the let us say the data sets that we get, we run them and then we get the results. So only correlating any data set that is available with you and correlating with similar kind of data sets which are available in the environment, so you will able to get it maybe in the this thing. So that is a bigger challenge. So if you are able to identify those functions which are getting compromised, or if you're able to get a data set and related functions, if you're able to find out and see, mostly a lot of research was done on system calls. Okay, so different system calls are observed, different system logs are observed, and a common methodology is revealed. And if the common methodology is found and in work in different techniques, you know that you are coming closer to the individual. So that's the kind of information you can try to pitch in. So that is attribution. So what we did in attribution, if you ask me, so these are various attacks which we launched and completed, but then one of the aspects that I would like to share with you, we have used this virtual machine introspection, which collects a lot of information about the virtual machines, about different data machines and all, and then they collect what is called these things. That is the we came up with three mechanisms: one at the hypervisor layer, one at the virtual machine layer, one at the two techniques at the hypervisor layer, and one technique in the detection layer at the network layer. In fact, attribution can be done at all these three levels: at the VM level, at the hypervisor level, and at the network level. But where do we start? The source is again packets. Packets are coming in. So you analyze packets. Maybe you use on Wireshark and all, and after modifications are done, they are again preserved somewhere. So you can try to capture that also. So that is the biggest challenge of this part. And let us see how it goes. So we will try to understand. So as of today, if you ask me, sir, how do we go about, how do we do it? There is absolutely no chance of trying to get the source. Hence, the very open challenge. A lot of people are working at network layer. They did work, but then they stopped because of packet marking and all. They are exhausted now. Cloud forensics attribution, cloud attribution is a very open-ended area. Nobody has done anything. There is hardly any paper. You please search. I also, once again, I searched last week, 2-3 days, when Anand told me that I'll have to take this talk. So there is absolutely no material on cloud forensics, but different pointers are there. So you can Start off from there, and then you can correlate from network forensics. You can try to bring into cloud forensics. Again, the basic idea is you can get hold of a data set and analyze it using machine learning and publish the related works, and then you can be happy. Right. So this is where I want to stop. I want to highlight only one thing, that there is a lot of challenges in trying to find out the problems. This is a very open problem. Nobody has done. A lot of work is done on network attribution, network source attribution. There are some transaction papers. There are some ACM transactions on information system security. Those papers. A lot of survey papers are there on source attribution. So you can try to correlate what was there in network, try to bring into cloud, and then you can work out. So that's a challenge that you have. So with this, I will stop. Maybe if there are questions, it will be better that I'll be able to take those addresses, questions of that. Okay, sure. If there are any questions, I will be happy to answer. Any questions?
Dear participants, if you have any questions, the field of cloud forensics, analysis, attribution.
So what could be a starting tool that can be used? Like if I want to jump into
the first tool that I would suggest is libvmi, right? So you can try to look at that, and then there are tools like H-Injector and TrackWolf. Let me check. Put up that slide. If I'm able to put up that slide. So there are some tools which are there, and then you can try to take that up and then work out those aspects. Very useful mechanisms are there where you can easily get through and show them. So I'll just 1 minute. Just give me a minute.
Sir, any direction towards energy minimization in the cloud computing, sir?
Energy minimization, yeah, you can please follow some of the papers on CloudSIM by Rajkumar Bhuya. Some work we did a couple of years ago on green cloud, right? You can look at a survey paper by some of my students, right? You can look at my Google Scholar, you will get that energy efficiency. And a lot of work has been done by Rajkumar Bhuya. Please visit his website, bhuya.com. I think Anand can place that website. Where you can look at the papers, and most of the papers are implemented on CloudSIM, which has also been developed by Bhuya sir. So you can please look at that aspect, and then energy efficiency aspects can be addressed from that. So let me share the tools. Yeah, these are some of the tools that you can try to work on. libvmi I've already talked about. Zen, along with Zen, there is Zen Access. There's an Ether tool to understand malware. You can try to look at that. TrackWolf is one tool. VMsafe is one tool. So these are some aspects. So there, some of this content I can share with you. You can try to look at TrackWolf, Zen Access. Right, Zen Access will be specifically for to work along with Zen server only. Or the Zen software, not with KVM. You won't have. KVM may have some other different mechanism. libvmi I already explained. H-Injector is a tool to inject hyperpol attacks. So you can get this paper on H-Injector. You can directly search in cloud and you can get the paper. So H-Injector injects hypercalls attacks during regular operation of virtual machines. Right. So this is something that you can try to do. Either you can do hardware virtualization, extension, malware analysis you can do. So that is some work that you can try to do it. Recall comes with the Windows environment, so you can try to do that. VM Safe is also similar. It protects the VM infrastructure. Some papers are there which are similar to VMI and HVI. So those papers also you can try to look at. That those are things like VM Watcher, right? So these are some papers which you can look at, and then you'll be able to easily identify and solve some of those papers, right? Some of those research.
Thank you, sir.
So that is the starting point. VMI, I think, is the starting point. And these days, recently, I've seen, I have not come across a tool on hypervisor introspection, but there are some papers on hypervisor introspection. So that is something that you can look at. And then this attribution you can try to build in sitting on the hypervisor. Like how you could sit on the DOM U and observe the virtual machine. Similarly, you can sit on the kernel of the hypervisor and observe the hypervisor, what all are happening. Obviously, you can also observe what all is happening on the systems also, and then you can try to detect the same. Yeah. Could you throw some light on Docker-based forensics? Yes, Docker, as you see, is lightweight forensics. I think you may have a session on Docker forensics also. I'm not sure Anand will confirm, but Docker basically is the word that is used for containers. In OpenStack, you have Kubernetes, which is an equivalent to the container Docker software. Docker is a name which is generic, and it is also a part of what you call this thing. And then you have what is called Moby project, which is an open source Docker. It's put up on the website in the chat. Anand has put it. So you can take a Docker which is readily available with the Moby project, and then you can modify the content. Right, you can make changes to that. So that is what is one aspect of how you can look at. But what we need to do in the case of containers are lightweight virtual machines. So there is no operating system that is there. That is what you can try to look at, right? In a virtual machine, there is an operating system. In a hypervisor, there is a host operating system. It is not a bare metal hypervisor, but it is a hosted hypervisor. There is an operating system. On top of that, there is a hypervisor, which we call it the Docker, or we call it the containerization software. The containerization software creates containers which do not have an operating system. It creates a layer. It creates a very bare minimum, what are the applications needed, what are the software needed. That's the kind of container is created. And that container runs on the hypervisor called the Docker. So it is very lightweight. So Docker forensics is very easy because one Docker can attack another Docker very easily because it's very lightweight. If there is one Docker and if it chooses to be malicious, then it can attack the other Docker which is running adjacent to it, and then create a lot of problems for the Dockers and all. So Docker architecture is what you need to start with. You need to understand what is the difference between Docker and so if you ask me, to work on Docker forensics will be easy than to work on cloud forensics. Dockers are easy to implement and work on, but then there is a little bit of complexity of setting up. And then Docker, per se, Docker, if you look at it, Kubernetes may have been coded in Python, but Docker has been written in Go programming language. So you need to learn a new programming language just to understand how the building is happening and all. Not much difficult. It is similar to Python and C++ and C. Not very difficult to learn. But then, yeah, it's a new language. So you can understand what is Go language. Right? You can read a little bit of Go language. Then you can take up Docker forensics. Any other questions? This is how a Docker looks like, Docker versus VMs. So this is infrastructure, this is operating system is same. If it is a hosted operating system, there's a hypervisor, but hypervisor is made into a lightweight hypervisor called Docker Engine. And then you have this guest OS for all these, but here there is no guest OS. There is only guest OS here. There is only one OS. This may not be needed here because hypervisor can become an OS. Then also these will be heavy because you have three, what do you call, guest operating systems running. Here, if you have just, of course, they are handling it separately using these bin files and library files become part of the container. It's easy, but then, yeah, this is something that you can try to understand. So this is how where Docker forensics starts. So you have to build with what is stored here, what is stored here, what is stored in these containers. From there you have to, and what is happening in this hardware is another aspect. So if you know that, then you will be able to work out. Yeah, hands-on, you can set up VMI. It will take a lot of time to show it immediately. May not be possible. I think VMI functioning, Anand may try because he has set up once. Dr. Anand, while he was doing his research, he has set up VMI and then checked up how the functions and how the things are collected. And then they have applied some machine learning algorithm and then built it up. So you can discuss with them. Yeah, it will take some time. If things are ready, we could have shown, but I think I don't think we have any ready-made these things which are set up. Please start doing. It's not difficult. Maybe a little bit of money needs to be invested if you want to create a cloud infrastructure. That's the point. Yeah, over to you, Dr. Anand. Anand or Dr. Pankaj?
Sorry, sir, I was mute. Sorry. Thank you, sir, for this informative session. You have shared a lot of things about attribution, virtualization, and also about how to start the research. That is like in cloud forensic, attribution is really a complex procedure, I will say. Tracing back even in cloud network is a bit difficult because from one data center to another data center will be a lot of time taking process. Any last question I can take from you? You can ask to sir. Please go through with those links which sir was talking about Docker, and even I have shared one Docker forensics for container from Red Hat, and some other links related to Citrix Gen server. You can directly download Buyasar website, CloudSim, GitHub, Rakov, H-Injector, LibVMI, OpenStack, Forenvisor, which I was talking about, and APIs from Google Cloud and for Google Drive.